Hello, coaches. Welcome back to episode 3 of our Hockey Eastern Ontario Skill Acquisition Series. We are delighted today to be joined by Rob Gray, a fellow Canadian. Rob is from Toronto, hails from the Toronto region. He is currently an associate professor in human systems engineering at Arizona State University. He's the host of the Perception and Action podcast, which I deem to be a must listen to for any coach out there working in the sport world. But more importantly than any of that for me, Rob is the author of 2 exceptional learning resources. He's the author of How We Learn to Move and Learning to Optimize Movement, both of which sit proudly on my shelf. And I will say I have read. But the first one for sure, coaches, How We Learn to Move is a must read. For any of us working with youth and trying to wrap our heads around this skill acquisition and how we get them to learn, how we want them to move and what we want them to do, the way we want them to do it, and the environments that we put them in to help achieve that. So we're very excited today to have Rob with us. Rob, welcome. I'll turn it over to you to let you do a little bit of a more deeper dive on your background and bio, and then we'll get started.
Thanks, Brian. It's a pleasure to be here. Yep. So I grew up an hour north of Toronto. I played ice hockey all my youth. I was a goalie. I always say that's what, gave me kind of interest in perception. It was survival, right? My background. Background training is in psychology. I went to Queen's University in undergrad and York University in Toronto. So I did all my schooling in Canada as well. I start out studying vision, basically understanding how we perceive movement, right? How do we know how long it's going to take before something hits us, like a puck, how much time we have, what direction it's going. So that's where I first started. And then I more slowly moved into understanding how we acquire skills, how we train to get better at sports skills, how should we design practice. And I've been doing that for a few years. The main sports I work in right now is in baseball, being here in Arizona. It's a good place for it. And golf, also a fair bit, and a few other sports. So I do a bunch of consulting as well with coaches and organizations and governing bodies. So understanding how people acquire skills. And as you mentioned, I've been doing the Perception Action podcast for a few years, and from that kind of spun out the books, kind of presenting this different way of thinking about skill. That I know as you mentioned, you had Stu and Ed on already talking about some of the different ideas to what we're traditionally taught about how we learn. Yeah.
Right. Well, welcome. We're thrilled to have you here. Let's jump right in, Rob, because I know you're a very busy individual in your line of work. So we'll try to keep this to 55 minutes so we can get you out of here on time and keep you on your busy schedule. In your first book, How We Learn to Move, there's an awful lot of reference and discussion and talk in there on a concept called perception action coupling.
Mm-hmm.
As a hockey guy, as I read your books, I kept hearing read and react, which is the terminology we kind of use in our game, that read and react skill. Let's dive a little bit more into sort of this perception action coupling. And in particular, it was very interesting. I've heard you speak a number of times where you talked about the athlete's need to not only perceive to act, but also act to be able to perceive. So I'm going to let you loose on that for a while, and then
perception action coupling is an idea that comes from a researcher named James Gibson. It's the idea that all our movements when we make are driven by what we perceive from the environment. What we pick up from our environment, and we don't always practice them that way, but that's the way it should happen. And so we have this link between I perceive, act, but also I act to perceive. When I looked around, when I'm going to receive a pass, I look around to know where I'm going to make the next pass or where I'm going to go. The example I love to use is a 2-on-1 in hockey, right? A skillful hockey player is moving so as to make the defender do something, right? They're trying to pick up information about what the defender is going to do, whether they're going to come to them, stay with the other player, and then make a decision based on what they're perceiving. So they're really acting so as to kind of make the other player do something so that they can perceive it. So it's the fundamental idea that all of our actions are always driven by information from the environment, and the idea that we need to keep that together as much as possible. So if we practice, when I practice stick handling around cones, I've taken away information. There's no perception there, really. There's no information from a cone telling you which way to go, as opposed to a defenseman that's leaning one way or the other. So it's kind of that basic idea that the two are always linked, and we have to try to keep them linked as much as possible. Yeah.
So you kind of touched a little bit on the cone example, and whenever we talk to people who are very embedded in the ecological dynamic perception type value of the environment sort of mindset, cones tend to be the most often used example when we start going around cones.
Yeah. In my sports, baseball, it's batting tees. Those are
batting tees.
You like to pick on.
Yeah.
Plastic things, right? Yeah.
So from a design perspective, as a coach in youth sports, minor hockey or any sport really, but we're talking hockey obviously in our example. What is the impact then? What would you describe as the impact on how a coach needs to think about perception and the power of perception when they're designing learning environments? So I sit down to design my practice environment. I'm putting together my activities. Like, what's the danger of me ignoring perception action coupling or putting the player in an environment where they can actually perceive things?
Yeah, the big danger, well, there's a couple. One is that, they're not going to know, it's not going to transfer into the actual environment, right? Every coach has seen the player that can stick handle and do all these tricks with the puck on their own. And then you put them on the ice when there's other players and they don't know when to pass, shoot, or what to do. So you're not going to learn when to do those things is kind of the big, and you mentioned read and react, you're not going to be a good decision maker. When do I pass, shoot, go left, go right? I do those things because I'm driven. I learn to use the information I pick up, my perception, to know when to do those things. And so if you don't train it that way, it's really hard to develop that kind of skill.
The coach or coaches that would then argue not everything we do is always going to be about perception. There are times where I just want to be very technical. The players need to understand or learn biomechanically or from a motor perspective how to move, not why to move, not when to move, just how to move. Where would you sit on that balance? Or is there a balance? Is there a chicken before the egg before the chicken scenario that we're talking about here?
Yeah, that's a common question. I comment, what don't they need? Usually people call it the fundamentals, right? You need to learn how to stick handle before I can put you against other players, or else you're not going to be able to manage, right? Big idea though is that, as much as possible, the how is determined by the what, right? Which way you go with the puck and how you need to move it is determined by what the environment is needed in the environment, what you perceive. And so you can't really separate those in the way people can. So I think you, as much as possible, we want to let it, the word we use is emerge, right? If you can create good practice environments, the behaviors you wanted to put in from the start will come out. That doesn't mean though, I think, you can't, as a coach, say, take a step back. You see a kid playing a small-sided game or something with a bunch of players, and they're really struggling controlling the puck. Like I don't think that more isolated. kind of work focusing on, controlling the puck, I think, that would fit well with the way I think. But what we don't tend to like is when you spend 45 minutes of an hour practice having kids by themselves handling a puck where they're not playing against any opponent. It's just the proportion of time devoted to fundamentals is so large. It seems like, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
We used to have this very predominant sort of theory in a lot of coach training in hockey, that whole part whole approach, where you start off with the whole and you kind of deconstruct it, or you break it down into its parts, and then you put it all back together again. Is that what we're talking about when we talk about creating environments that are going to allow our players to perceive, to see things, and respond to what goes on around them? Is that really what we're talking about? Putting them in the hole?
Yeah, a little bit. The whole part whole is kind of the old kind of way we've done it for long, is sometimes we call it decomposition, breaking the skill apart, right? So that's what stick handling around cones is. You're taking the act of controlling the puck out of the game, out of the having people trying to take it away. So that's kind of part training, pulling it out, training just one part of it, right? They're kind of, so in an ecological approach, we try to move away from that as much as can, and rather simplify. So keep the skill whole, but make it easier somehow. So less players, more space, different pockets, easier to control, things like that.
Sure.
But still having kind of the full skill intact. That's what we kind of try to aim for.
Okay. When we had Stu and Ed on, representative learning design came up.
Yeah.
Keeping our environments representative of the game, and it was made clear by both Stu and Ed that it didn't have to be exact. It didn't have to look exactly like the game, but it had to represent. How important in this concept of perception action coupling is representative learning design make or break? Can you get perception action coupling in your practices if they're not representative, if you're not doing things that are representative?
Yeah, I think so. For me, perception action coupling is one of the kind of the criteria you need for representative design. That's the way I would put it, right? So for representative design, we want our actions to be driven by the information that's going to be in the game, other players, pucks, rather than some artificial flashing lights or something that's making you decide which way to move. So to me, perception action coupling is one of the main components of representative design that you really want to look for, having the right information, having actions that are like the sport, similar types of movements, dynamics. Yeah. So yeah, I think they go together very well.
Yeah. You just said something that was really interesting. You said in our environments, we want our players' actions to be driven by what goes on around them. We have a tendency sometimes in hockey and other sports, it's not just hockey, I'm not picking on hockey here, but there's a tendency sometimes that as coaches, we will stand at a rink board and we will tell players what we want them to do.
Yeah.
And then we say, go do it. How dangerous, I use the word dangerous, maybe in its extreme word, but how dangerous does that become as coaches when we are constantly supplying the solution?
Yeah. I think, it's going to, all of these methods, right? Yeah, I always try to put it, it's going to help them. All of these methods, people learn, we learn almost no matter what we do, but we're kind of talking about more effective. And the big kind of thing we would worry about is kind of how adaptable are they going to be? How creative are they going to be? Are they going to figure out what to do on their own when they get in a situation they haven't been in before? Well, it leads to we're a kind of fragile skill when you're always being told what to do. Yeah. So I always like to say you want to give athletes problems to solve, not the solutions themselves, right? Let
Right.
them figure it out. And then also that it doesn't take into account very well individual differences, that the possibility that they might have a better way of doing kind of the solution than you do, right? Because they know their own for their own body what works for them. Yeah.
Right.
It doesn't mean you can't guide them, and right, but as much as we try to move away from the kind of old telling, do this kind of approach to coaching. Yeah.
Yeah, because this came up when we had the episode with Ed, that whole theory of, putting them in a place where they can perceive, where they
Mhm.
can determine their own solutions, and then from that we can then extract whether we have to isolate or get technical,
Yeah.
you know?
Add more. Yeah. I think so. I think letting them get in those situations. Then as a coach, yeah, if the solution they come up with, is not going to be effective or potentially lead to injury, then yeah, that's where you can step in, add something else to the environment, add some instruction for sure. Mhm.
So now we're talking about constraints-led approach. Like you were
Yeah.
talking about,
Yeah.
we've created an environment. It's not really kind of going where we want it to go. So we constrain it, we twist it, we tweak it.
Mhm.
We don't really take out the perception, but it's going to guide them in a little bit of a different way. Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. Like on a, so the idea is, can we, the way I always describe it, can we think of something to add to the practice environment that's going to kind of force the athlete to move differently and in a kind of in a way we want, right? Um, so if they need to, we want them to bend down more. Here's a silly example, bend down more. We could say bend over, bend your knees, or we could just give them a shorter stick, right? And have them figure it out, that kind of thing.
Right.
Or, work on stick handling, given a, ball that bounces around more, that kind of thing. Mhm.
Yeah. Great. Switching gears just a little bit,
Mhm.
kind of flowing out of this, but in both of your books and on several podcasts where you've been a guest and you've talked about these topics, the concept of action capacities
Mhm.
has come up. I'm going to just open with a real simple question for the coaches that are watching and listening. How do you define what an action capacity is?
Okay. Yeah, this is a little tricky one. So action capacity for me is like a physical or psychological ability. So it's like speed, flexibility, strength that is kind of it allows gives you the way I like to say it is action capacities give you the potential to be more skillful, right? So being a faster skater, skating speed in hockey is like a capacity. Gives you more opportunities to drive around defenders, get through gaps, right? It gives you it's giving you more possible movement solutions, right? So capacities are individual capabilities that the athlete brings to the table that we can develop. Usually we're doing those in a very isolated uncoupled manner. Like we train strength in the weight room, lifting weights. It's not, we don't do a reactive read and react in the weight room, right?
Right.
So we're building capacities. So it's the individual kind of things that an athlete brings and could allow them to be more skillful. Mm-hmm.
So, as coaches, then, what is the impact? So, again, going back to designing practices,
Mm-hmm.
what is the impact on me as a coach when I sit down to start planning the skills I want to develop in my players, the things I want them to learn? If I don't take into account their capacities,
Mm-hmm.
where can that go south? Like, what is the impact of, like,
Yeah,
where,
I think,
like,
yeah. Yeah, yeah. If we do that, then we're not, the kind of the movement or technique you're trying to get them to do, they might not be able to, right? They don't have the capacity to actually achieve that. Um, That's kind of the biggest. You're not kind of taking into account their individual, what they bring to the table and what's going to work for them based on the capacities. Most coaches have a good sense of this already, right? They can tell by, looking at a player. But yeah, that's the general idea.
Now, are these action capacities, when we look at a hockey player,
Mm-hmm.
and we're trying to, as a coach, we're trying to evaluate or assess the athlete so that we can kind of, or just in general, we're trying to determine what are the action capacities a hockey player needs.
Mm-hmm.
Speed, quickness, flexibility, strength, power. A lot of these things sound like biomechanical, motor related. Like they sound very, physical. And you mentioned there's also some psychological things, your emotional
Yeah.
strength and your
Mm-hmm.
we'll call it your brain power.
Yeah.
Is that all they are? Can action capacities come outside of that category, or are we typically always talking about things that, I train in the gym, I train away from the ice to get them better so
Yeah.
that they can come into the practice rink with me?
Yeah. So I generally like to try to keep them there because the problem I think happens a lot is people treat skills like their action capacities. Like stick handling is not an action capacity; it's a skill, right? It's a purposeful, goal-driven movement where you're picking up information. There's lots of possible ways to do it. How your action capacities, your speed, your balance come into that, but so I think we have to be careful. Like one of the things we love to do in sports is treat agility like it's an action capacity, right? We're going to have you run around, we're going to train and run in these tires and ropes and whatever, and then you'll be able to pull that out and put it in the game. Whereas those are real skills. I like to think of them as better. Yeah.
So what I'm hearing, Rob, is as a coach, there's always a potential that I could be placing my athletes in a learning scenario or a learning environment where I am asking things of them that physically, from an action capacity perspective, they are not able to do.
Yeah, I think so. I think there's just trying to get them to move in certain ways or use certain movement patterns that they may not be able to achieve. Or and the other one that I've seen before, it's kind of, they might actually not see the opportunity that you want them to see, right? Why didn't you drive through that gap, right? If they don't have the capacity, the speed to do it, they don't even really see it as an opportunity. So yeah, that definitely can happen.
So that brings me now, that last comment you made about, why didn't you drive through that gap?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I didn't even see it.
Yeah.
And now what we're talking about is, we've kicked around sort of perception and action coupling.
Mm-hmm.
What I see, what I read can drive how I act. How I act can then change what I see or how I perceive things.
Yeah.
Now what you're suggesting to all the coaches is, if a player is not skillful, they might not perceive things that we see. Is that correct?
Yeah. So going kind of in the ecological approach is this idea of what we call embodied perception, right? So we don't see the world in terms of that thing's 5 meters away, that's a meter tall. We perceive the world in terms of our ability to act on it. So there's research showing that, for example, if you ask people to judge the slope of a hill, they say it's higher when you make them wear a heavy backpack full of books, right? Because they have less capacity to climb it, they perceive it as steeper, right? So if I don't have the same speed and ability to accelerate, a gap's going to look smaller to me than someone that, because it's not going to look like you can get through there. Mm-hmm. That's the idea. It's sometimes called embodied perception. Yeah.
Embodied perception. Yeah. So
we perceive the world in terms of what our body allows us to do with it. Mm-hmm.
So a player that may not be the greatest skater on your team will potentially perceive things they see around them. Mm-hmm. much differently than your greatest skater on the team.
Yeah, for sure. Going to see less opportunities from the environment, kind of. Yeah, and we've seen this. We see that we've done some research with how big batters perceive the baseball to be, and that depends on their skill and various other factors, how big it looks. So that kind of weird, the net looked as big as a ocean. Kind of weird comments athlete makes sometimes have some truth to them. Yeah.
So I've heard you tell our coaches the capacities that an athlete possess will greatly dictate what they can achieve from a skill acquisition or how they can become skillful at a point in time. So if I don't possess the capacities, I will be limited in things I will be able to do. I've heard you also say, if I am limited in the things I can do, I will actually see fewer solutions to problems in my environment. Does this all connect to the concept or the dangers we get into when we try to coach or teach to what you referred to as the one ideal solution?
I think so. I think that's, and that doesn't mean that they can't be successful, right? They just might have to do it a different way, right?
Sure, yeah.
But yeah, I think so. I think, especially with younger kids that, they find out they can't do that, and they get discouraged and, don't want to come back to practice the next time. Yeah.
So and this is a bit of a baited question. You probably look at me, you'll probably look at us and go, I can't answer that. But what I'm hearing then is, if I'm coaching or working with a team of hockey players and I have 15 of them, I have to be prepared to accept 15 different solutions to things.
Yeah, I think you have
potentially.
Allow for variability and, different ways people are going to respond. Yeah, and that's a very challenging thing, obviously, right? Being a group of different skill levels and trying to coach to it instead. But, as much as we can, we do want to kind of individualize and let people, sometimes the term we use, self-organize, people, let your kind of own body find what works for it. Yeah.
Okay.
So
we have, or I should say I'm no longer a school teacher, but in the education system, we have what we call, or what are referred to as IEPs, individual educational plans. But in the sport world, we kind of tend to take an entire group of players on a team and clump them under one solution umbrella.
Yeah.
There's one way to skate. There is one way to shoot. There is the right way and all the other ways. Everything we've just discussed and what you've shared with us about action capacities, so I'm going to call them the physical or motor traits of the athlete, and what they possess or do not possess, that impacts how skillful they become. And then how skillful they are impacts solutions they perceive in the environment. I now, as a coach, have to be really, really careful about adopting this notion of all 15 of my players should be able to do everything the same way.
Yeah, I think you have to think more in terms of, what is it that's in common between the good skaters, like the principles, right? The expression I use, Randy Sullivan and I use in our baseball book, is think conditions, not positions, right? So there's conditions to being a good skater, balance, all the, that those don't have to be achieved by the same body position exactly by everybody. This knee bent in this way, that's kind of the way we like to think. So it doesn't mean you can do just anything. Like, there's certain things that have to be there to be a good skater, for example. But there's lots of different ways to achieve that same thing.
Interesting. Now, you mentioned, you just very quickly mentioned the concept of self-organization. Just for our coaches, before we dig into some questions around self-organizing, just for our coaches, like, what is a simple definition of players self-organizing? When a hockey player in practice is self-organizing, what does that look like? What are they doing?
So the basic idea is so their body is kind of reacting to the environment to kind of find something that works, right? So if I want to stay balanced and I go a little too far on, bend my left knee a little bit too much, my body will automatically put tension in my ankle or something. They'll work together. So your body's kind of working together to keep balance rather than your brain saying, okay, bend the ankle now, stretch your leg, right? So your body's just kind of making these adjustments, and sometimes we call them synergies, but different parts of the body working together to achieve your goal. Yeah. So the example I always give for self-organization is a flock of birds, right? So a flock of birds each bird kind of moves together without anyone telling them all what to do. That they kind of self-organize themselves.
So is it an individual concept, or can it apply also to like a group? Like, can you have 5 or 6 players self-organizing together?
It can, so it can apply individually. Your body, the different parts of your body are thought to self-organize, but also at the team level. The different parts of the play, working together, right? So player, like a good team on defense, right? As one player goes to the shooter to the puck carrier, you want another player to change where they are and move to fill the gap, right? Without having to tell everyone exactly, a set of rules of how to move. Yeah, so it applies to both for sure.
Okay.
Yeah, so team coordination. So it applies to team coordination and individual coordination of your body.
So is just trying to think of the analogy that might exist in the typical sort of hockey coaching jargon. Is self-organizing just another way of saying I'm allowing the players to find their own solution? I'm giving them a space to learn within. I might be constraining that space. Maybe it's rules or numbers of players or size of space, but I might be doing something to manipulate the environment. And then I just let them learn. I let them find their way, or as you put it, I let them self-organize.
Yeah.
Am I right here?
Yeah. I'm letting them, I'm kind of guiding, that's the essential of the constraints side approach. I'm adding something to practice that kind of takes away what they're doing now and encourages them to do something different. But what they do different, I'm going to let them self-organize. I'm going to let them figure what that is on their own. Yeah.
Now, I kind of want to pull some of the stuff from Stu and Ed forward, because we've come through into our third episode now, where what we're talking about is this whole ecological dynamics, constraint-led approach, nonlinear learning, or nonlinear pedagogy, as the research calls it. Mm-hmm. Can I achieve the things that you talk a lot about in your book, perception and action coupling, that read and react quality of the practice environment? Can I get self-organization? Can all of that exist if, as a coach, I either do not understand, or more importantly, I am not really working inside of an ecological approach, or I don't practice design nonlinear formatting, and I'm not using constraints-led approach? Like, if those things aren't there, do I lose all of that other stuff, or can it still exist?
I think it's very hard. I think, for example, if you are telling the traditional, telling the player the solution, like you're talking about their body a lot, and I still see this is a really hard thing to move away from in sports. That's the way we all learn. That's the way we want it. If you do that, right, what you're essentially doing, you're not allowing the body to self-organize. You're trying to tell it what to do. which inherently leads players to try to do that, right? So players start getting, in the research we call it an internal focus of attention. So really thinking about what your body's doing. How much is my knee bent? Where's my elbow? Which that has shown to hinder self-organization. So I think it's hard. It would be very hard, I think, to use a lot of the kind of things traditional kind of coaching methods and promote self-organization. There's a lot of different ways you can promote than just constraints. There's some other things you can do, but I think it would be hard. You definitely need kind of coaching methods that are commensurate with it.
Right. Now, this series, this 5-part series is kind of, it's certainly centered around a different way of looking at skill acquisition, kind of breaking away from the traditional, moving coaches more towards an ecological mindset. Things are nonlinear, and how to go about designing practice and promoting that within the learning environment.
Yes, for sure.
Is this all or nothing for you? Like, I've asked all of our guests this so far. Like, are we talking about, I've either got to be all ecological, or I have to be all non-linear or all linear? Can balances occur here?
I have a kind of strong opinion. I tend to think it's hard to do both ways. I think you really need to commit to it. For example, like a lot of things I see, like in hockey and soccer, a coach will set up a small-sided game to kind of let athletes figure it out, and then they'll start it, and then 15 seconds later, they'll jump in and start telling players where they should be and what they should be doing, right? So to me, I certainly meet a lot of coaches that kind of want to kind of stick with. So I try to meet coaches halfway all the time. So, okay, you want to keep doing that? Okay, how can we make it more variable, more representative, and try it? But I think in the end, if you have kind of a consistent one approach, I think it would be better. I know not everybody agrees with that, though, I think. But I think a lot of them seem to be they're fighting each other. The different things, yeah.
Okay. I asked that question because there was a really interesting comment. I can't remember. I believe I stole it off another podcast that you spoke on. And the comment was, if you feel you're using a constraints-led approach, so if as a coach you feel like you are in that CLA approach model, ecologically nonlinear driven, and you're doing your best and you're trying it, but if the result of that doesn't have your players self-organizing, then you're really not in a constraints-led approach.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's at the practical level, it's hard to decipher. And I guess, I say you have to do kind of one or the other, but to me, there's nothing wrong with an ecological approach with if something's not organizing the way you want it,
right?
Trying to guide people. Like I'll set up a constraints drill in a batting practice, and then the batter's, kind of struggling with it. I'll say, why don't you try bending your knees more? Right. So it seems like but it's just meant to get them to try that. It's not meant you have to do that. So it depends on how you do it and how you use it, I think. But yeah, I think, if you're adding a constraint to force them to move in some exact way that you want, then it's probably not really the constraints that approach in the first place. So yeah. So yeah.
Okay.
But so I think, committing to the idea of self-organization and representative design and kind of pushes you kind of in a certain direction for sure, where everything kind of flows together.
One of the real trends, certainly, again, I keep referencing your books that you've written and that I've read and following you as a learning resource. But one of the real trends that I hear and I see is, and this is my phrasing here. It's not anything I'm quoting from what you wrote or said, but it's the sense that I get that as coaches, we need to try to find ways where we don't start with isolation, linear, giving them the solution for the sake of getting them to a game or representative environment, but rather start with that representative environment and then pull out into that isolated format when we feel like, okay, now I need to, but then get back into that representative environment sooner than later.
Yeah. Or even more idea than pulling out, like, can I add some other kind of constraint or change the environment to kind of help this person? Yeah. Like I coach tennis every once in a while, and instead of having a kid stand in a line and here's how you do a forehand, you put your 1 foot back, you put the one in front. I'd much rather just play, rally the ball over the net and see what happens. And usually 9 times out of 10, they'll adopt that position anyway. But then you could come across a kid that has no eye-hand coordination at all and can't hit the ball at all. So that is just keep putting them into that rallies is not going to be productive. We have to kind of pull it back and work on some more fundamental things, maybe bigger ball, not lower net, different kind of things. Yeah.
Fabulous. Rob, before we sign out here, how can coaches connect with you, follow you, hear you speak more often?
Yeah, so the easiest way is perceptionaction.com is my kind of main website where I have my podcast and my books, and I do some YouTube videos every once in a while. But yeah, that's the main place. Yeah. Right. But yeah, and there's a place to contact me there if you have any kind of specific questions.
Excellent. Yeah. Fabulous. And for all the coaches watching, you will clearly see on the bookshelf behind Rob both of his books, and the one in the green cover with the large word "move." I cannot stress enough. It is a real game changer when you read that. The second one, probably fair to say, Rob, that your second one gets a little bit more scientific.
Yeah. It's kind of
but the first one I thought was absolutely fabulous. It stays relatively simple. It's easy to understand.
Thank you.
Very applicable to the hockey world. So yeah, coaches, it's definitely if you're in the local Amazon online bookstore someday, it's a shameless plug for Rob Gray.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I'll take it.
Rob, thank you so much on behalf of myself and Hockey Eastern Ontario and all of our coaches. Thank you so much for taking time out of what I know is a busy schedule. And we will certainly get this published online and let our coaches start listening and hearing, and hopefully it'll drive their journeys like this stuff has with me over the last 6 to 7 years, and start getting them. We said in the early episode when we started this, the goal is to start providing opportunities for coaches to think about a different way. And if we can get coaches moving a little bit more away from that old traditional linear isolation solution driven type of coaching, and start dipping their foot in the shallow end, maybe a slow start, but to start dipping their foot into the pool of this information and these methodologies, it'll be I think it'll be a real gain for all coaches who give it a whirl and try it. I know in my coaching, especially my skills work that I've done, I've adopted more of this over the last few years. And it's certainly a much more fun way to coach.
Yes, for sure.
I enjoy it much more, and I think my athletes enjoy it much more as well. So,
cool.
So again, Rob Gray, thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure, Brian. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you.